Absolutely, absolutely. I'm very excited to be here, and it's really nice to look out at the smiling faces on video and see that I recognize a lot of you from different networking and events over the last couple of years. So that always makes it nice on a early Tuesday morning. So hopefully while you're drinking your coffee this morning, you're getting an opportunity to get a lot of really good information. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Katie Magoon with People Solutions Center. We are an HR consulting firm here in the St. Louis market. I've been in business for myself for 4 years, but I actually have about 20 plus years of HR experience prior to this. I was with Commerce Bank for several years, and then with Progressive Insurance for a large bulk of my career. And the reason that I know so much about virtual onboarding is when I was at Progressive for 15 years, all of that work was virtual. And that was way before virtual was the thing that everybody did. I never actually worked. I led teams for 12 of those 15 years. I never once worked in an office where any one of my team members sat. On several occasions, I had new employees who started that I never met until they had been on board for at least probably 3 months, if not 6 months. And I've also helped organizations figure out how do you onboard a new employee successfully, even when we don't have that immediate face-to-face that so many of us are used to. So all of that is gives me the ability to draw on not only sort of best practices, but personal experiences. And I think that I'll be more than happy to share all of that with you all today so that you can be thinking about how do you do this in your own business as you move forward.
Thank you. You know, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, some people think that onboarding is just paperwork. Can you tell us what really onboarding is?
Absolutely. So onboarding is the approach and process you take to ensure that you really integrate an employee into the organization from beginning to end. And so honestly, if you do this well, you actually don't have an employee even touch a piece of paper because they can do all of the HR paperwork online these days. And it's a best practice from an HR perspective, and it's a whole lot easier for employees. In fact, most of it can be done before they even walk in on day one. But instead your focus is, how do you help a new hire understand your company culture, adjust and integrate into your company culture, build the relationships they need to be successful in the role, and most importantly, really understand the job that they're supposed to do and the expectations of that role. And so it is maybe less than 1% about the paperwork and the first day, although the first day is a very important one, but it's really about what you do over the course of, I would say, at least about a 6-month period. And when we build onboarding plans for clients, what they get is like, here's what you need to do before the person even starts. Here's what you do day one. Here's what you do week one. And then 30, 60, and 90 days. And then a 6-month check-in along the way, because this is not, you can't integrate somebody into your organization in a week. It takes a lot longer than that. And most people are there about 6 months before they really start to feel comfortable in the role that they're in.
Can you explain a little bit about, let's just say at 6 months. So what are you saying? What are you sending to them? What's
how does that look? Yeah. At the 6-month mark is really a good opportunity for a check-in for how are things going. So, you know, what should this, first of all, it's feedback back. It's a coaching discussion around what should this person start, stop, and continue doing. If you think about the last time you started a job, which for many of us, we haven't done this, you know, frequently or certainly recently. When you hit that 6-month mark, you start as an employee to feel like, I think I've got this. And as soon as that creeps into your head, all of a sudden on the other shoulder is this little voice that says, well, what if I don't? And so the 6-month mark check-in is really to reinsure to the employee, first of all, let's make sure they really have it. Let's see how they're feeling about the culture and the organization, and are they feeling like they fit in and they have the tools they need. On the flip side, it's about telling the employee, here's how you're doing, so that they don't have that little voice in their head that's bringing doubt and concern to them. So that 6-month piece is a check-in from that perspective, somewhat with the manager, but also I highly encourage, if you have somebody in HR or who plays that HR role, this is a good opportunity for them to check in as well. Because sometimes there's a little nuance that somebody's not unhappy, but they just need a little bit more reassurance or a little bit more advice on how to make their way through the organization. And so that dual check-in can be really helpful. The other piece that can be helpful at that time is this is a great opportunity to, one, get feedback on what it was like to be a new hire and what it was like to be a candidate. And also, do these folks have, especially if you're hiring more than one person, who do they know, and then would they be able and willing to refer a friend? So it serves multiple purposes at that 6-month mark, but if you've done a good job, you can gain a ton of information from that conversation.
You read my mind with regard to, so is this a manager or an HR perspective, but bringing those things into the fold with regard to referrals and that type of thing, that opens up a whole new world, I would think.
Yeah, this is a perfect opportunity to ask. And if somebody says, like, if they give you that really worried look, that might be a sign that you need to ask more questions about how they're doing. Sometimes it's, I would totally refer somebody, I just don't know anybody, and that's a different set of circumstances. But I can ask somebody how they're feeling about their job all day, and they might have a great poker face, but the minute I ask, do you have any friends you would refer, they lose the poker face a little bit, and you start to know whether or not they're really feeling good about things.
Yeah, I bet. How, I would think that virtually, I mean, you and I know each other, but building a relationship online is difficult, in my mind, and certainly much harder than when we see each other at networking events or that kind of thing. How do you kind of ease that or build that relationship when you're doing it online?
Yeah. I will tell you, it's interesting. It can be a little bit more difficult in that you have to be more deliberate about it and you have to be intentional about it. But when you are deliberate and intentional, I actually find these relationships are stronger rather than weaker. Because you were deliberate and intentional. When we meet over the cup of coffee in the break room, those conversations happen naturally, but they're not necessarily fruitful. And so you have casual conversation, how's the weather, but you don't actually find out enough about somebody to build trust. When you do this virtually, you have to plan out, how are you going to engage with this person, and how are you going to make sure they engage with the team members in a way that people really do get to know each other and share information about their backgrounds and their experiences and get to know each other on a very personal level. And that, for some reason, when we're face-to-face, we make the assumption that that will just happen. And so versus in the virtual world, we're so worried it won't happen that we actually plan it out. And when we plan it out, it accelerates that trust because we've had to actually spend time working on it. And so ironically, the thing that people are most worried about not working, if you do this right and you have a very intentional approach to building the relationship, you will find that the trust builds faster and it probably has a stronger foundation to it.
Is there a secret question that you have that, like, again, opens things up, or?
Yeah, so there's a series of questions that you want people to engage with, and that's really the key piece to this. They're not necessarily specific to being virtual. It's just a matter of when we do this virtually, we actually take the time to ask them. But it's things like finding out the basics of somebody's background and experience, learning enough about them. One of the things I think is a great tool when you're onboarding people in the office, but it's even more critical in a virtual onboarding, is DISC assessments. DISC assessments give you a sense of what someone's personal style is and what their preferred approach to communication is. And it is absolutely a conversation starter, because this is the person taking an assessment that gives them feedback on, here's how you believe you act in situations. And I find because the person answered it themselves, they look at it and go, oh my gosh, like that is what I do. The number of times I've taken somebody through a disc and they're like, can I email this to my spouse? Because this would explain everything. There are tools that are invaluable. And so when we use those in the onboarding process, particularly in the virtual setting, it opens up a conversation right off the bat where people are saying, they're, you know, you as the manager or the coworker are reading the information and sharing your own information as a coworker to say, here's who I am and how I operate. And now it starts a conversation about, well, what resonates the most with you? And why, you know, what about your experience has that be your preference? And how has that played out with other people? And now we ask questions that actually help us build a relationship. One of the other exercises that I have found to be particularly helpful, if anybody has read the book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, Patrick Lencioni does an exercise very early on in the book with the team where he has them answer 3 questions. And when I first read the book, I remember thinking, those are the dumb, like, there is no way that exercise works. And yet I have done this over and over again with volunteer organizations, with companies, and every time we do the exercise, it does amazing things. And the 3 questions are super simple. It's, where did you grow up? How many siblings do you have and where do you fall in the order? And what's one thing from your childhood that kind of builds, makes you who you are today? And they seem really easy, but as people start to share that kind of information, they lean in a little bit more and they make themselves a little bit more vulnerable. And when we make ourselves vulnerable, then we start to trust. And when we trust, now we have the foundation of a strong relationship. And so the idea in virtual onboarding is you need to accelerate and be intentional about giving people opportunities to build that trust, both between the employee and the manager, but also across coworkers. And so setting up opportunities where they have the chance to share about themselves, about who they are and how they approach the world, gives people the chance to build trust. And the tools that you can use to do that when you plan them out make a huge difference in terms of how those relationships come together. And that can happen via video because it's really about the conversation. It's not about, can I see your face or can I hug you or all those things that we probably won't hug people as much anymore. So.
Yeah, which brings us another question in another day. But
yeah.
So are there other best practices that you would include in virtual onboarding?
Yeah, so one of the most important things you can do in virtual onboarding is have a plan. When we bring people into the office, now I will tell you, again, you should do this when you're onboarding people in the office as well. But you have to do it slightly differently when you're doing it virtually. When we are building a virtual plan, we have to be very precise in our approach. You can't just say, oh, on Tuesday, we'll learn how to make that spreadsheet. You need to actually plan and schedule the time. So your first week, and honestly, I would say even the first 2 weeks, send a plan to the new hire in advance that says, here's what your schedule is going to look like. Particularly in this day and age where many people have never onboarded virtually, so they don't know what to expect, so they're just as nervous as you are. And what if I start and then, it's one thing if I'm in the office and you introduce me around and then I sit at my desk for a few hours because nobody planned out what I was going to do, at least I see other people and I know I'm there. In a virtual world, if you don't have a plan for me for 2 hours of the day and I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, I'm just floating and I don't know that you even remembered you hired me. And that's a scary moment. And so what you want to do is have that schedule out. So the last person, actually, ironically, Kathy Fleming, who is my business development specialist, who many of you have met, I onboarded Kathy virtually, which is really weird because we both live in St. Louis. But at the time that she started, I had to be in Chicago for a family. My father was ill and I was staying up there for a little bit. And so we did virtual onboarding with Kathy, with me in Chicago and her in St. Louis. And it's about being planful. So we had scheduled times, first thing in the morning, right after lunch, and at the end of the day. We had calendar invites, we got on the phone and we talked. The times in between, I either had moments where I was teaching her something by sharing my screen, or we were talking through pieces. But some things are like you just need a new hire to read through information or do some research on their own and kind of build their own information. So give them that block of time. Tell them during this time frame, here's the 3 things that I'd like you to go over, and then we're going to get together after lunch so that you have the opportunity to ask me questions and we can talk it through. So people can read on their own, digest information, and then there's a regroup to talk about what are your takeaways, what questions did you have. But when those scheduled times are on the calendar, now as a new employee, you know, yes, I'm doing self-onboarding work, but everybody still knows I'm here. Everybody's going to call me back. I'm still like, they haven't forgotten about me. And so it's through that kind of scheduling for the first 2 weeks that you just get really deliberate about what are people going to be learning during different periods, who are they meeting with. Let's get that on the calendar so that an employee knows exactly what's going to happen and they don't feel like they're just floating out in the atmosphere wondering if you're ever coming back.
And like you said, that's probably a good practice even in the office. So many times you hear about people that are sitting there at their desk for hours. Yes, you can see people, but it's like, I want to do something. Let me get something accomplished.
Yes.
It's
It's really amazing. Nothing you do virtually has to be all that different than what you do in person. But the reality is it is, because we don't do the things we should probably do normally. And you have to be successful virtually, you have to be good at it. Like you have to be decent at it to start with and then take it to the next level. And that next level just, bumps it up enough that you're connecting with people.
Are there any pitfalls, for lack of a better word, that you would warn people of with doing this?
Yeah, there are. One of the first things you need to do, especially if you as the manager is not the person that's doing most of the training with the new hire. If, for example, I'm your manager, but your peer is going to do most of the training, you need to make sure that whoever that peer is that's doing the training is really comfortable with this technology and with this kind of setting. Because if they're already frustrated, and particularly during this time where employee emotions are, anywhere on the curve, right?
Right.
If you have somebody who's frustrated by working at home, and then you set them up to spend 2 hours on a Zoom call with a new hire, and they spend that entire time talking about how horrible this is and how much they hate being online, and they're just in a bad space. Bad moods translate even more abruptly over Zoom than they do even when you're in person. So, because that's all I can see is your bad mood and your unhappiness about things. So make sure that you're really thoughtful about who is doing the training. Or if you have somebody who is a subject matter expert and needs to be the trainer, pair them up with somebody who knows the technology well enough that the technology will work for you, so that they don't get frustrated or bogged down with the thing they don't know. They get to showcase the thing that they do. And sometimes, especially right now, while this is new to some people, that piece will be really important in terms of making sure that this goes well. I cannot stress, if you don't have a plan, virtual onboarding will not go well, and you have to get the whole team on board. The virtual piece means they cannot feel like I'm only building a relationship with my manager. They have to have opportunities to have one-on-one time and team building time to really get to know their peers as well. Because when you work virtually, sometimes people will feel like they're on an island and that they're by themselves unless they have a strong network in the organization. And so you have to help that person build that network. And we don't realize how much of that sometimes happens naturally over the cup of coffee or the, hey, this person invited somebody else to go to lunch. So you need to do things like set up virtual lunches with one-on-one with each other, have virtual cups of coffee in the morning, give people space to just talk to each other, which we don't really always think to do when we're onboarding in the office.
All right. Those are all excellent points. And again, I truly appreciate this. We have like 6 minutes left. So
yeah.
Anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask Katie? So while they're thinking, or just in case, is there anything, well, let me ask you this, and Andy,
I
I'm
think
sorry.
Andy was raising his hand.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
And you know what? I
raising
forgot
hands
to
still
say,
works.
I forgot to mention the chat.
Do you find that it's when you're doing virtual interviewing and other things, I think we've all experienced the rare opportunity where the person you interview is not the one that shows up.
Mhm.
Is there, do you find that to be similar, different, or when you're doing it virtually?
Yeah, it could be, you know, the piece, especially when you're interviewing virtually, my recommendation is it might take at least one extra interview. And here's why. We as interviewers are not particularly comfortable with the connection between two people via technology. We're just not used to it. And so we don't necessarily interview the same way we would if we were in person. And we're not as good at just paying attention to and asking the right questions during the interview. And so if you've had multiple opportunities to interview somebody via technology, by the time you've met 2 or 3 times, which I would not normally recommend in the recruiting space, but by the time you've done that, you'll be much more comfortable with it, enough that you start to ask the right questions and have the right conversations, and the technology won't get in your way. That's probably the biggest challenge, is that we're all uncomfortable anyway. You add to this the virtual piece and it gets awkward.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have anything?
One more. Kate, you say, do a 6 months evaluation, but I'm assuming you kind of do check-ins along the way, because again, you've got, if you find that somebody's not working, it's better to find that out earlier than later.
Yes.
I'm presuming.
Absolutely. So when we build onboarding plans, there is typically at the end of 2 weeks, we do a check-in. And that is typically an HR check-in, because you'd be amazed at how off the rails something can go in the first 2 weeks. So 2-week check-in is some sort of HR or third person kind of, hey, how are you doing? How are things going? It's less about the person's performance and more about, are they making the relationships they need? Are there any challenges? Do they have the resources they need? The 30-day check-in is a bit more on, like, this is where we pull out the pieces of paper we gave them on the first day, the job description, the handbook, and we go back over the onboarding plan. What did we say we were going to cover in the first 30 days, and have we actually done it? You would not believe the number of times we write an onboarding plan and then it goes in a drawer and nobody knows it was like, we don't know what happened. Job description, we pull it out and we say, okay, here's what we talked about in the first week. Is this flushing out the way you expected it to? And have you received some sort of training in all of the key parts of this that you should be so far? How are you feeling about these different pieces? And then a conversation about, okay, based on 30 days, here's what you should start, stop, and continue doing. We do the same thing at the end of 60 days. We do it again at the end of 90 days, and those can almost all be at the 90-day mark, a check-in again with HR, not a bad plan, because again, that's where they're gonna have started to, if something's wrong, you're gonna know it. And then that final check-in at the 6-month mark to make sure that everybody is on the same page. But yeah, there's coaching conversations, regular check-ins, weekly, if not twice a week, one-on-ones, depending on the level of job and what you need. Scheduled one-on-ones are key, particularly in virtual world. You can't just do, oh, I'll check in with them today at some point. You need on the schedule, on the calendar, appointments for when you're going to touch base with people.
Terrific.
Hey, Katie, I'm curious, are there things in the onboarding process that are typically missed that cause a delay in the onboarding with new employees?
Yeah, you know what is so it's a little ironic. There's 2 things that are most commonly missed. One, we're not intentional on integrating somebody into the culture. We assume that somebody being in our environment, they'll just pick up on who we are and how we operate and what we care about. We tend not to sit down and say, here's the vision of the company, here's our mission, And most importantly, here is how